What if I told you one of the most explosive guitar players of the 1960s played a legendary set at Woodstock, and almost nobody saw it? 500,000 people stood in the mud that night, while a skinny guitarist with white hair and pink eyes tore through the blues like a lightning storm. The crowd went wild, but when the Woodstock movie came out, his entire performance was missing, cut from the film, erased from the official story. Just months earlier, record labels had fought over him in a bidding war worth $600,000, one of the biggest contracts ever given to a new artist at the time. His name was Johnny Winter, and his life would become one of the most intense stories in blues history. Johnny Winter was born in Beaumont, Texas, in 1944. Beaumont was a refinery town on the Gulf Coast, where the heat hung in the air and oil money fueled the local economy. It was also the Deep South during segregation. Life followed strict social rules, and standing out could make life very difficult. Johnny stood out the moment he was born. He had albinism. His skin was pale white, his hair was bright white, and his eyes were extremely sensitive to light. His vision was also very poor. In a small Texas town during the 1950s, looking that different made him an easy target for teasing and stares. But inside the Winter household, music mattered more than appearances. Johnny's father, John Winter Jr., worked as a cotton broker, but music filled most of his spare time. He played saxophone, guitar, and sang in barbershop quartets. Records played constantly in the house, and both Johnny and his younger brother Edgar grew up surrounded by instruments. Johnny first learned clarinet when he was about 5 years old. Later he tried the ukulele, but when he discovered the guitar, something clicked immediately. The guitar felt like it belonged in his hands. Around the same time, another influence entered his life in a way nobody expected. The Winter family had an African-American maid who often listened to the radio while she worked in the kitchen. One day, Johnny heard a sound coming from that small speaker that stopped him cold. It was the blues. Artists like Muddy Waters, B.B. King, and Howlin' Wolf were pouring emotion through their guitars. The sound was raw, loud, and honest. It felt completely different from the music he heard on most white radio stations. Johnny was fascinated. Soon, he started searching for that sound wherever he could find it. As a teenager, he began sneaking into black clubs around Beaumont and Houston, just to watch the musicians play. He studied their hands, their rhythm, and the way they bent the strings. By the time Johnny reached his mid-teens, he was already performing around Texas. In 1959, he recorded his first single, School Day Blues. With his band Johnny Winter and the Jammers. It did not become a national hit, but it proved something important. Johnny Winter was no longer just a kid listening to the blues. He was becoming part of it. For nearly a decade, Johnny Winter lived on the Texas club circuit. Night after night, he hauled his guitar into smoky bars across Beaumont, Houston, and Austin. The pay was small, the crowds were unpredictable, but the stage became his training ground, and every year, he got better. By the early 1960s, musicians across Texas were already whispering about the pale guitarist with the blinding speed. Johnny did not just copy the blues, he attacked it. His playing was loud, aggressive, and faster than most players had ever heard. Then came a moment people in Beaumont would talk about for years. In 1962, B.B. King came through town for a concert. Johnny was 17 years old. Somehow, he managed to get backstage and convinced the band to let him sit in for a song. At first, King was cautious. Standing in front of him was a skinny albino teenager asking to play the blues. Then Johnny started playing. The tone was sharp. The notes bent and screamed. His fingers moved across the fretboard with shocking speed. Within seconds, the room changed. King later admitted the kid clearly understood the blues. Not just the technique, but the feeling. And that validation meant everything. Johnny kept grinding through the Texas circuit for the rest of the decade. While the rest of America was exploding with the British invasion and psychedelic rock, Johnny stayed locked into the blues. His sound grew heavier, louder, and more intense with every show. But outside Texas, almost nobody knew his name. That changed in 1968. That year, a reporter from Rolling Stone magazine traveled to Texas to explore the growing underground music scene. While digging through clubs and local bands, the writer stumbled onto something unexpected: Johnny Winter. The article described him as one of the most exciting guitar players in America and called him the hottest item outside of Janis Joplin. Suddenly, the industry was paying attention. But wait, this next part changes everything. A New York club owner named Steve Paul read the article and immediately booked a flight to Texas. Paul ran a famous Manhattan club called The Scene, a place where musicians like Jimi Hendrix and Eric Clapton often stopped by to play. Paul believed Johnny Winter could be the next guitar superstar. He convinced Johnny to come to New York and play a surprise appearance at the legendary Fillmore East in December 1968. The concert already featured major names like Mike Bloomfield and Al Kooper. Johnny was simply the unknown guest. When he stepped on stage, most of the audience had never heard of him. Then he started playing It's My Own Fault, a slow blues originally made famous by B.B. King. Within minutes, music executives in the crowd were scrambling. The guitar was blazing. His slide work screamed like a siren. The audience leaned forward, stunned by the speed and intensity coming from this white-haired guitarist. By the time the song ended, something rare had happened. A bidding war had started inside the theater. Major record labels rushed backstage, each one trying to sign Johnny Winter before the others could react. Columbia Records finally won the battle, with a contract worth $600,000. To put that into perspective, that was more money than many established rock stars were earning at the time. Almost overnight, Johnny Winter went from a Texas club player to one of the most expensive new artists in the music industry. But the success came with a problem. Another record label claimed they already owned his contract, and the legal fight that followed almost stopped everything before his career even began. Lawyers started circling Johnny Winter almost immediately after the Columbia deal was announced. A Houston producer named Roy Ames claimed he already owned the rights to Johnny's recording contract through an earlier agreement. Ames insisted Columbia had no right to sign him. Columbia disagreed. What followed was a messy legal battle that dragged through offices and courtrooms, while the music industry waited to see who would win. Johnny, meanwhile, did what he had always done. He played. Eventually, the dispute was settled, and Columbia moved forward with Winter's first major release. In May of 1969, the album Johnny Winter finally arrived in record stores. It was loud, it was fast, and it sounded nothing like the polished rock music dominating radio. The album blended traditional blues with explosive electric guitar. Johnny ripped through songs like Be Careful with a Fool, Mean Town Blues, and Good Morning Little Schoolgirl with blistering speed.
How bad you treated I'm a little schoolboy too.
His slide guitar screamed through the speakers, and his voice carried a rough Texas edge that felt authentic. Listeners noticed immediately. The album climbed to number 24 on the Billboard chart. For a pure blues record from a brand new artist, that was a huge achievement. Suddenly, magazines were calling him the next great guitar hero. But the biggest moment of Johnny Winter's career was just around the corner. In August 1969, hundreds of thousands of young people gathered on a farm in upstate New York for a 3-day music festival that would later define an entire generation: Woodstock. The lineup already included giants like Jimi Hendrix, Santana, The Who, and Janis Joplin. Johnny Winter was scheduled to appear late on the final night. When he stepped onto the stage, the crowd had already been awake for days. The field was soaked with rain and mud. People were exhausted. Then Johnny hit the first note. The effect was immediate. His guitar tore through the night air with incredible force. Song after song exploded across the stage. His brother Edgar Winter joined him on keyboards and saxophone, adding even more energy to the performance. By the time they launched into Johnny B. Goode, the entire crowd was roaring. Many people who attended Woodstock later said Johnny Winter delivered one of the most electrifying sets of the entire festival. But here's the strange part. Almost nobody saw it afterward. When the famous Woodstock documentary film was released, Johnny Winter's performance was missing. His manager, Steve Paul, reportedly refused to allow the footage to be used because of contract disputes and disagreements over payment. So, while millions of people watched the movie and the soundtrack album turned into a cultural monument, Johnny Winter's performance was left out of the official record. For decades, his Woodstock moment existed only in the memories of people who were actually there. But Johnny was not slowing down. Later that same year, he returned to the studio to record another album. The result was something the industry had never quite seen before. The album was called Second Winter, and instead of a normal double album, it came with 3 sides of music and a completely blank 4th side. Record executives expected artists to fill every inch of vinyl. Johnny refused. He believed the album was finished, and he was not about to record weak filler songs just to satisfy a format. So the 4th side stayed empty. It was a bold move, and it showed that Johnny Winter was not interested in playing by the music industry's rules. But the road that followed would begin to take a serious toll. By 1970, Johnny Winter was one of the most talked about guitarists in rock music. Concert promoters wanted him everywhere. Fans packed theaters just to watch his fingers fly across the strings. But Johnny was not interested in slowing down. Instead, he pushed the music even harder. He formed a new band called Johnny Winter and. The lineup included guitarist Rick Derringer, along with members of the band, the McCoys. The group had a heavier sound than Johnny's earlier blues recordings. The music leaned closer to hard rock, while still carrying the raw energy of the blues. And the band delivered one of Johnny's most recognizable songs, Rock and Roll Hoochie Coo. The track exploded with loud guitars and swagger. Rick Derringer handled the vocals, while Johnny's guitar work drove the song forward like a runaway train. It quickly became a signature moment in their live shows, and helped push the band deeper into the growing rock scene of the early 1970s. But while the music was getting louder, life on the road was getting darker. Touring in the early 1970s was relentless. Bands traveled constantly, playing show after show in different cities every night. Sleep was rare, parties were everywhere, drugs were easy to find, and heroin had quietly become part of the rock world. Johnny began using it during this period. At first, it seemed manageable. Many musicians around him were experimenting with it, and the culture of the time often treated it as just another backstage indulgence. But heroin does not stay recreational for long. Soon, the drug began tightening its grip on Johnny's life. His schedule became chaotic. Recording sessions slowed down. Friends noticed he was becoming distant and exhausted. Then the music world was hit with devastating losses. In 1970, Jimi Hendrix died. Only weeks later, Janis Joplin passed away. Both were enormous stars, both under the age of 30, and both victims of drug overdoses. For Johnny Winter, those deaths felt like a warning. The same darkness that had taken 2 of the brightest stars in rock was now pulling at him as well. So in 1971, Johnny made a decision that saved his life. He checked himself into River Oaks Hospital in New Orleans to quit heroin. And this was not the kind of celebrity rehab people imagine today. There were no luxury clinics or carefully managed detox programs. Johnny went cold turkey. The withdrawal was brutal. For weeks, he battled severe physical pain, sickness, and intense cravings. The process lasted months. Johnny later described it simply as horrible. But eventually, he made it through. When he returned to music in 1973, he wanted to send a message to everyone who believed he was finished. The album was called Still Alive and Well. Produced by Rick Derringer, the record delivered powerful blues rock with songs like Rock Me Baby and Cheap Tequila. The title itself said everything Johnny needed to say.
Like my back ain't got no more. Head, young head, close it high.
He had survived, but the music industry was changing fast. Glam rock was rising. Bands were filling stadiums with huge theatrical shows. Radio stations were beginning to favor slick production and polished sound. Johnny Winter's gritty blues style suddenly felt old-fashioned to many record executives. The industry that once fought to sign him was already moving on to the next trend. But wait, because this next chapter would take Johnny Winter somewhere nobody expected. Instead of chasing commercial success, he decided to help revive the career of the man who had inspired him in the first place, Muddy Waters. And what happened next would win 3 Grammy Awards. By the mid-1970s, Johnny Winter could have focused entirely on rebuilding his own career. The The album Still Alive and Well had proven he could still play with power.
Every now and then I know it's kinda hard to tell, but I feel alive and well.
Fans still showed up to concerts. But Johnny was thinking about something else. He was thinking about the man who had first pulled him into the blues, Muddy Waters. Back in the 1950s, Muddy Waters had helped invent the sound of electric Chicago blues. Songs like Hoochie Coochie Man and Manish Boy influenced an entire generation of musicians.
That mean Manish boy. I'm a man. Yeah.
The Rolling Stones even named their band after one of Muddy's songs. But by the 1970s, his career had drifted into trouble. His longtime label had started experimenting with modern studio tricks, layered instruments, and psychedelic sounds that did not fit Muddy's style. The results felt forced, and fans could hear it. One of the greatest blues singers in history suddenly sounded lost inside his own records. Johnny Winter believed the solution was simple: strip everything back. In 1977, he convinced Muddy Waters to record a new album with a completely different approach. The album would be recorded live in the studio with a full band playing together in the same room, just like the old days. The album was called Hard Again.
That rubber band man. Yeah. No beat.
From the first note, it was obvious something special had happened. Muddy's voice sounded strong again, the guitars growled, the rhythm section locked into a deep groove. Johnny played guitar on the sessions and pushed the music forward without trying to take the spotlight. The record felt alive. Listeners and critics immediately noticed the difference. Hard Again went on to win the Grammy Award for Best Ethnic or Traditional Blues Recording. More importantly, it restored Muddy Waters' reputation as one of the most powerful voices in the blues. Johnny was not finished. The next year, they returned to the studio and recorded another album called I'm Ready. The energy remained just as strong. Muddy sounded confident and fierce, and Johnny's production kept everything raw and direct. That album won another Grammy. Then, in 1979, they captured the excitement of Muddy's live shows with Muddy Mississippi Waters Live. Once again, the album won a Grammy Award. 3 albums, 3 Grammys. For Johnny Winter, those recordings meant more than trophies. They were a way of honoring the music that had shaped his entire life. The same sound he had first heard coming from a small kitchen radio in Texas was now echoing across the world again. But while Johnny was helping restore blues history, his own life was becoming more complicated. He had stayed away from heroin after his recovery, but other struggles slowly crept in. Alcohol became a constant companion. Prescription medications began entering the picture as well, often given to him for anxiety and depression. At first, it seemed manageable, but the years of heavy touring, hard living, and constant pressure were starting to take a toll on his body. And by the late 1990s, something much worse was happening behind the scenes. Johnny Winter was losing control of his own life. Concert reviews began describing a shocking sight. The once explosive guitarist now walked slowly with a cane. He played seated on a stool, hunched over his guitar. Many fans feared they were watching a legend fade away. But what nobody realized was that one person was about to step in and change everything. By the late 1990s, something felt wrong whenever Johnny Winter walked onto a stage. Fans could still see the legend, the white hair, the Texas drawl, the famous Gibson Firebird guitar. But the energy that once exploded through every performance had faded. Johnny moved slowly. Sometimes he needed a cane just to reach the microphone. Most shows were performed sitting on a stool. His hands still knew where the notes were, but the speed that once stunned audiences was clearly gone. Behind the scenes, the situation was worse. Johnny had fallen under the management of a man named Teddy Slatus. Slatus had his own problems with substance abuse, and many people close to Johnny later said the relationship became deeply unhealthy. Winter was touring constantly, even when he was physically exhausted. At the same time, he was being prescribed heavy doses of medications, including several daily doses of clonazepam. The drug left him groggy and disconnected. Friends later said there were periods when Johnny seemed barely present between shows. Some concert reviews from the early 2000s read more like medical reports than music criticism. Fans worried they were watching one of the greatest blues guitarists slowly disappear. But wait, because this next moment changed everything. In 1999, a young guitarist named Paul Nelson entered Johnny Winter's life. Nelson had originally been hired as a musician for recording sessions, but when he arrived, he quickly realized something was terribly wrong. Johnny was not being cared for properly. Nelson began helping behind the scenes. He encouraged Johnny to see doctors who could review his medications. Slowly, they began reducing the heavy prescriptions that had left him in a haze for years. When Teddy Slatus entered rehabilitation in 2003 and later passed away in 2005, Nelson stepped forward and took over managing Johnny's career. His goal was simple: give Johnny Winter his life back. And slowly, it worked. Johnny's health improved. The fog lifted. He began performing with more focus and confidence again. Fans noticed the change almost immediately. The fire that once defined his playing had not vanished. It had simply been buried under years of poor management and medication. Then, late in his life, Johnny recorded what would become the final chapter of his musical journey. The album was called Step Back. Released in 2014, the record featured guest appearances from several famous guitarists who admired Johnny's work. The music returned to the deep blues roots that had always defined him. The album later won the Grammy Award for Best Blues Album. For many fans, it felt like the perfect closing statement, but the story ended only months later. In July of 2014, Johnny Winter was touring in Europe when he was found dead in a hotel room near Zurich, Switzerland. He was 70 years old. He had been performing just days earlier. Johnny Winter died the same way he had lived most of his life. On the road, guitar never far from reach, still chasing the sound that first captured him as a boy listening to blues records in a Texas kitchen. His influence runs deeper than many people realize. Guitarists like Stevie Ray Vaughan and countless Texas blues players built their sound on the path Johnny helped open. His work with Muddy Waters revived one of the most important figures in blues history, and his own recordings proved that raw American blues could still shake the world. Johnny Winter never chased trends. He chased the blues. And once the blues gets inside you, it never really lets go.